I request Professor Nagaraj Paturi sir to kindly deliver his lecture on cultural bias in research. So before requesting him to deliver his lecture, I would like to give just a small short introduction of Professor Nagaraj Paturi sir, who is at present working as a dean in Indic Academy. So he's a senior professor with 3 decades of university teaching and research experience, including fieldwork-based cultural research. He specializes in cultural studies, including folk culture studies, linguistics, including Sanskrit linguistics, literary studies, including myth studies. So this is a small introduction of Professor Paturi sir. I request Paturi sir to kindly deliver the lecture.
Thank you, Srinivas Garu. The topic of cultural bias is part of a broader topic called bias. Cultural bias is one kind of bias, and as we see, the word itself is a pejorative word, it's a negative word. So the idea is that we have to avoid it. And when we talk of bias, we get into the other words in terms of research methodology also, which are almost synonymous or closely related to bias, which are subjectivity, value loadedness, and the opposite of it is objective, value free, value loaded. Opposite is value free. And value freedom is considered to be one of the ideals of research. And objectivity is also considered to be one of the ideals of research. And when we say cultural in that, the value loadedness, which is the opposite of value freedom, is being looked at as coming from the culture of the researcher. If the bias or the lack of objectivity in research is coming from the culture of the researcher, that is considered to be the cultural bias on the part of the researcher. It's a very vast topic, so to cover it in the next 30 minutes, I think I should classify the whole cultural bias into different kinds. Let me classify that into cultural bias in natural sciences or basic sciences and cultural bias in social sciences and humanities. On the one hand, the natural or basic sciences like physics, chemistry, biology have been seen as highly objective, free from cultural bias, and the very origin of these natural sciences or basic sciences has been seen to be an overcoming of the cultural bias that people had and all that. We have to check whether that claim is true or not. And the other side, the social sciences and humanities, have always been viewed as prone to cultural bias because these disciplines deal with human beings and human groups and social groups. And it is here that cultural bias has been already identified. Students, while being taught in general mainstream universities, which are not IKS universities or which don't deal with IKS, they are taught about these biases. For example, in fields like cultural studies, anthropology, sociology, and folklore, folk literature studies, folk culture studies, in all these fields, they use words like nationalist bias, romanticist bias, and so on to talk about cultural biases. So if you, for example, are imagining some village to be a naturally beautiful society, full of goodness, full of nice people, innocent people, and all that, and if your conclusions are based on such views, they use the word romanticist bias. This is a romanticist view, and there is a romanticist bias, they say. And if the perspective is based on a view that one's own nation is great, so something coming from that nation has to be good, then they say, oh, this is coming from a nationalist bias. And they have, in the European history, they have their own historical reasons for identifying this. There was Romanticist philosophy, there were Romanticist movements in arts and culture, and there were nationalist movements, and European nationalisms emerged. And they have all those reasons for identifying these biases in the research. But one cultural bias that was identified during postmodern times that came handy for Indian, Hindu, and other researchers in social sciences and humanities was Orientalism. This concept was brought by Edward Said, and interestingly, he brought that concept to discuss the bias in the Western media coverage of Islamic topics, Muslim topics. So we actually get surprised at such claims that, oh, is there a bias in the Western media while covering the Islamic topics? But taking cue from that, most of the other non-Islamic societies and cultures also started using the word Orientalism as a word to talk about the cultural bias on the part of Western researchers while dealing with non-Western cultural, social, and group topics, community topics. So students, while doing work in IKS, particularly if their topic is a social sciences and humanities topic, have to get an understanding of what is this whole Orientalism and all that. Raju Malhotra ji coined a new term called Neo-Orientalism also. Uh, just not Orientalism. He said Orientalism is an older phenomena during the colonial times, but Neo-Orientalism is an Orientalism during the post-colonial times. The Orientalist tendencies continue in the Western coverage of non-Western topics, including the Indian topics. That is so. By learning cultural bias called Orientalism, the IKS researcher would be able to expose the cultural bias in the topics, coverage of IKS topics in the Western uh, representations or Western research publications or Western peer-reviewed journals. If an IKS article is getting rejected, for example, in a peer-reviewed journal controlled by Western management, we would be able to expose that, showing that there is a cultural bias there. So there are many such new words and concepts that are emerging to talk about the cultural biases with which IKS topics have been viewed by the Western societies, and how that carried into the Indian mainstream universities while dealing with IKS topics. So we, while working on IKS topics and dealing with our own kith and kin living in mainstream universities, while we are proposing these IKS research results or proposals to the mainstream universities, which are colonized in their thinking, which are controlled by the Western thinking, then we have to be aware of these cultural biases in the Western coverage of IKS topics. And we have to argue while presenting our research or while presenting the arguments in our research. We have to be aware about this, and we have to argue, we have to take that as a Purva Paksha, and we have to take that as a tool of our Khandana argument towards the Purva Paksha. Also, that there is an Orientalist bias in the earlier representations in my Purva Paksha. So why I am doing khandana of that, and my Siddhanta is coming because I'm able to see the problem of Orientalism in the earlier representation of the topic that I have chosen for my research. But if we think that these biases are limited to social sciences and humanities because we are dealing with human beings and social groups and all that, then we are mistaken, because of late there is also another awareness that is coming up, which shows that in the other fields like natural sciences and basic sciences also, the research so far has not been so much objective. The so-called objectivity in social science, in basic sciences and natural sciences, is also a myth, and that has been exploded mostly during postmodern times, and also particularly from environmentalist studies. All the Western scholars themselves who did environmentalism studies, they showed that the research in basic sciences, not just basic sciences, technology areas connected to these basic sciences also, not just the scientific discoveries of theories, even the technological innovations have been controlled by the cultural bias of an anti-environmentalist thinking, anti-nature thinking. So that also the IKS researcher has to be aware. There are many benefits of being aware of this anti-environmentalist, anti-nature bias in the previous science and technology. One basic benefit of that is when you are talking about, when you are answering questions like from the youth of India today, why we did not have this technology, why we did not have that technology, why India was not able to invent that, and all that, the answer always comes from this kind of worldview of the society, culture, worldview of the culture, controlling the technological innovation also. So when you answer the questions, why a particular technology of ancient India was only in this direction. For example, why wet cells in electrical production, in battery based DC production in India were not chemically controlled, why nature based, herbal based wet cell technology was only used in ancient India. The answer comes from nature friendliness. So if you once put this in your mind and start thinking about the ancient Indian technology, you might get several answers for why only that kind of technology, why not the present kind of technology. Answers come from being aware of that cultural bias in the technological innovations post enlightenment, post the influence of anti-environmental thinking coming from, for example, Genesis of the Bible. Lynn White Jr. comes up with this article, Roots of the Ecological Crisis, where he says that it is the genesis of the Bible which led to the whole environmental crisis. So, by reading all such literature about anti-environmentalist culture influencing the S&T, science and technology of the contemporary times, IKS researchers would be able to understand why only certain technology, why not the other technology. The other is not just, I guess research is not always about digging out the ancient Indian knowledge. It is also to continue new discoveries, new technological innovations based on the ancient Indian thinking. So when an IKS researcher comes up with a new technological innovation also, being aware that there is an anti-environmentalist bias in the present technological ideas and innovations, that will be very handy. Actually, I have been asked by many artificial intelligence related groups, which are now being called as AI ethics groups, to join them and add IKS based ethical thinking into AI ethics. Where actually the AI ethics researchers, AI researchers coming from India were able to see that there is a very wide field that is coming up called AI ethics, which can benefit a lot from Dharma thinking. And the entire global AI ethics world can get benefited from the Dharma thinking. So these are the places where the future research, not just digging out the ancient Indian knowledge systems, but even the future research can be benefited by realizing that there is an influence of culture, there is an influence of worldview on what kind of technology comes up, or what are the limitations of limitations that can be imposed on the technology, how the unlimited uh, aspects of the technology have to be controlled based on ethical considerations. All these come from the awareness of cultural bias. One more cultural bias that we generally are not aware that we too have, not the Western society towards Indian society, is that we ourselves have many cultural perspectives about ourselves. We need to overcome those cultural biases. For example, an IKS researcher might be coming from a traditional Sanskrit trained, Shastra trained environment, and he might not have, for example, experienced the tribal society, forest dwellers society. He might not have observed that. And there is a cultural bias possible in that kind of a researcher, that he might have a preconceived notion, prejudice towards the uh, thinking of the tribal group, thinking of the forest dweller Vanvasi group. So I am sure, actually, with my experience with interaction with the Shastra scholars, one thing I keep telling, that Shastra research or Shastra thinking from millennia has been cultural bias free, because Shastras have developed such rigorous tools of thinking that the tools themselves can help them to overcome any bias, not just cultural bias. All biases are removed from them. Only thing that they need to do is they have to be aware that their tools can help them. They have to employ those tools that are already provided in the Shastra, that can help them overcome their possible preconceived notions of the worldview of the Vanvasi group, worldview, the technology that the Vanvasi group is using, or the food preferences of the Vanvasi group, or the hunting habits of the Vanvasi group, or their worshipping practices, and so on and so forth. Then they will be able to dig out the indigenous knowledge systems of the Vanvasi groups, uh, empathetically, and trying to find out the beauties of the Vanvasi science and technology, Vanvasi knowledge systems. In the same way, we have a large amount of folk knowledge systems, ethnic knowledge systems. People use words like ethno-medicine, medical practices of the village groups, village communities, various jatis and their jati traditions, and their jati-based indigenous knowledge systems. Actually, for this group of audience, I don't think I should explain that Jati system has been a wonderful system of not just a knowledge system preservation, and also it was also a knowledge system dissemination through hereditary practice of those knowledge systems. So when the IKS researcher goes to approach and dig out the knowledge systems available in not in textual form, not essentially in the textual form, but just in a practice form and also in an oral literature form, then the IKS researcher, if he is coming from a non-folk family background, a non-folk upbringing background, a non-rural upbringing background, he has to overcome these urban biases. He has to overcome the modern biases. He has to overcome the Brahmanical biases if he comes from a Brahmanical family. And he has to overcome all these intra-Indian, intra-Hindu cultural biases towards the other cultural aspects within the Hindu knowledge systems, within the Indian knowledge systems. Even these are possible cultural biases. And to be completely Vedic centric, or to be textual centric, or to be centric towards a particular Shastra perspective alone is also a cultural bias that can come in the way of digging out non-textual, practice-based, oral knowledge systems that are abundantly available in India. And in contributing, not just digging out, in contributing them or in representing them, while representing those, after digging out, when you represent those knowledge systems also, the biases, cultural biases that come from a certain family upbringing, certain living settlement pattern in which you live. Urban is a settlement pattern. City, town is a upbringing that you have, a cultural environment, cultural setting you have. So if you are coming from such an upbringing, modern upbringing, for example, you have to be aware that this modern upbringing, urban upbringing, mainstream university upbringing, mainstream education upbringing also has induced a lot of colonial cultural bias in you, that is making you look at the Indian knowledge systems, whether it is traditional Vedic, Shastric knowledge systems, or they are folk, rural knowledge systems, which are practice-based and oral mostly, and the Vanvasi practice-based and oral knowledge systems, or any other such Indic knowledge system that you are approaching. We must be aware that we have a lot of cultural inducement that has happened through our modern upbringing. There is both kinds of problem. One is that when we go with a mindset that okay, a lot of harm has been done to our knowledge systems in both their digging out and representation because of colonial educational system, Macaulay's educational system, and all that. There's a lot of that baggage with which we go. It's good. It's a good baggage only. But what happens is that there is a machoism, there is an unnecessary emotional attachment to what we are working on. Even that has to be overcome. We have to actually uh, convince ourselves first and the world afterwards that what we are digging out in the form of a knowledge system, whether it is from Vaidika Shastras or from the Gramina Janapada Jnana Vyavasthas, or Vidya Vyavasthas, or Kala Vyavasthas, or Vidyasthanas, or the Vanavasi Vidyas, whichever we are working on, we have to first convince ourselves that we do not have any Purvagraha. We do not have any Bhavuka Duragraha or Sadagraha while working on those topics also. And then only when we are convinced about we being not with any duragraha or purvagraha, then we can convince the world that our conclusion, our understanding did not come from any purvagraha. And mostly our purvagrahas come from our sanskaras, vasanas. Let us be very clear that sanskara is not always a neutral word. There can be dussanskaras also, not only satsanskaras. And even vasana, in Vedanta, we use that word vasana in a very pejorative sense, but there can be sadvasanas also. So these are cultural elements that are coming in us, which lead to a purvagraha. And why we today are able to see all the rishis and all the authors of our ancient Shastras to be giving ideas which are very close to the discoveries of modern, the so-called objective discoveries, universally applicable discoveries, is because they, as a rishi training, rishitva itself is overcoming the bias, overcoming the cultural bias, overcoming duragraha, overcoming purvagraha. All that is a personality development. Overcoming cultural bias is a personality development. Being tatastha, nishpaksha, all this comes from nisangatva, at least of a certain level. Sangha includes both raga and dvesha. So we should not think that dvesha alone is a problem. Even raga is also a problem. Raga is also a kind of sangha. And if there is a nisangatva while dealing with your problem of research, while dealing with the focus area of your research, then that personality development of at least having nisangatva as an ideal. You need not say that, oh, I'm not a sthita prajna. Sthita prajnatva is a high achievement. And after becoming sthita prajna, I may not be interested in IKS at all. I might be interested only in my Jivan Mukti Sthiti. And I might be interested in only in my moksha. But the attempt to get into that kind of personality development where Shunichaivasya pakecha samadarshana is possible, that helps in being away from the purvagraha with which we come up. Why samadarshana is missing in Shuni or Asyapaka? It is because of a personality problem. That personality problem emerges from the upbringing, from culture. So, a Rishitva kind of personality, if developed for IKS research, that is enough to overcome the cultural bias. The, all that the Shastra gurus have been training in their Shishyas is also this only. They don't say that you should not be patriotic, or you should not be a Shraddhalu, or you should not be a Bhakta, or you should not be a Sadhaka. But your sadhana, your Shraddhalutva, your Bhakti, all that need not come in the way of approaching the truth, approaching Satya. Is what we have to notice. When we attend Vakyartha Sadas, when Shastra scholars discuss among themselves, there is an amazing amount of overcoming of their Shastra bias itself. They, for example, a Shastra scholar can easily say that, okay, you are right in your own way because it's a Mimamsa point of view. That's a Mimamsa point of view. I don't disagree with you. I am a Vaiyakarana, so I come from my Vyakarana position. From my Vyakarana position, I should not be talking to you against your Mimamsaka position. That's okay. From your point of view, you're perfect. So there they are training themselves that there need not be a Shastra based, Swashastra based cultural bias. So once that comes, you can see in them that within the Vedanta shakhas also, they say that, okay, that is perfect as far as Advaita view is concerned, but I have a different view from Advaita. So this kind of training from the beginning and being completely calm and cool in approaching the other, whether it is other Vedanta Shakha or it is the other Shastra, no emotions at all. That is a personality development that we can emulate from the Shastra scholars. And did we see any Shastra scholars not being patriotic? Did we see any Shastra scholar not being a Shraddhalu or a Bhakta or a Sadhaka? Uh, being a Shraddhalu, Bhakta or Sadhaka or a Desha Bhakta need not come in the way of approaching the truth, overcoming the cultural biases from which we come. I have seen Shastra scholars also say, for example, if we present them the cases of a rural knowledge system in which there is a certain kind of medicine, a medical practice, or a Vanvasi medical practice or a knowledge system, they approach these things in a very friendly way. I'll cite one example of how Jnanendraji living in Varanasi, he comes from Nepal and he settled in Varanasi. He teaches Nyaya and a few other Shastras in his Graha Gurukula. He was asking me, जी आप वनवासी लोगों के बारे में काम करते हैं, हमको एक दो उदाहरण दीजिए, आप क्या परिशीलन किए हैं. I was telling them about how in our observations, hunting knowledge systems or practice-based knowledge systems, and these cannot be objectively verified using tools and all that. I was telling them how eyes of the hunter control the animal, uh, and after controlling the animal through the looks only, the hunter actually takes the animal into control and uh, hunts it. Then his response, a Shastra scholar's response was, देखिए, उनकी ये तपस्या है. He was very open to it. There is no cultural bias. He did not say, हाँ ये तो वनवासी लोग है, ऐसे कुछ हरकत करते रहते हैं. This was not his response. He was saying, हाँ देखिए, ये उनकी तपस्या है. Tapasya, the word, he did not hesitate to use in reference to a Vanvasi, while actually tapasya is always expected to be the domain of only a rishi. Only a rishi has to be a tapasvi, is the general cultural bias that we have. But the tapasvi himself, the Shastra scholar, he is a great tapasvi. Jnanendraji himself is a great yagnika. He performed a yajna during our Indic Academy's Vakyartha Sadas. We sponsored a yajna also there. He was he was the Shauti. He was conducting the yajna perfectly. And he was a tapasvi in his personal life also. But he was able to use the word tapas in reference to the amount of control, psychological control the Vanvasi person is able to get in himself, so that almost a vibhuti, if we have to use Yoga Sutra vocabulary, almost a vibhuti of being able to control a particular animal during hunting was being noted, and he was able to say, oh, this is the result of a tapasya. So this ideal that we can see in Shastra scholars, that comes from a Shastra-born personality development, a rishitva that comes into these people, has to be emulated by all IKS scholars. So all kinds of cultural biases, colonial cultural biases, have to be exposed from the West, and environmentalist cultural biases in the Western science and technology, Westbound science and technology, has to be exposed. We have to expose the biases of our Purva Paksha, but also my request is we have to overcome our own intra-Indian, intra-Hindu cultural biases towards the cultures in which we were not born and brought up also. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Acharya. So this is a very needed topic to be discussed, that too especially to the students and researchers of IKS, because in IKS arena, cultural studies and social science studies are not prevalent enough as they are in the other disciplines. And this point that you have made is really very much indeed a very insightful talk. Thank you very much, Acharya, for your. I think you have. Even answered the question while in your lecture itself on how do we mitigate cultural bias in the Shastras. I mean, what are the tools? If you can answer that also. I mean, what are the tools that have mentioned in Shastras, or one or two, which help us to mitigate cultural bias? Can you give any?
Yeah,
I think you
if
have given a living example of Gyanendra Sapkotaji, but still,
yeah,
if
that was an anecdotal example. But if you go into Shastra, for example, in Nyaya, when we talk of Lakshana and the doshas in Lakshana, they are all the doshas of Lakshana we talk about, they are actually cultural bias born doshas only. But the Shastra doesn't tell you that that is coming from a cultural bias. The Shastra, for example, tells you that this could be a dosha, but that dosha actually is coming from a cultural bias only. I'll give you an example from my own field, Vyakarana and Vyakarana Darshana. Bhartrihari goes to the extent of saying that while identifying the artha of a shabda, Rushinam yacha darshanam natat shabda nibandhanam. He says you have to be so unbiased that even if a rishi has given that meaning to that word, you should not take it, because talavad drushyate vyomaha. The sky can look like a plain area.
Kadyoto
Kadyoto havyavadiva. Kadyoto havyavadiva. Even a firefly can look like a fire only. Uh,
Natalam vidyate vyomni nakadyote hutasha.
Natalam vidyate vyomni. Yeah. Even Rushinam yacha darshanam. He goes to the extent of saying that simply because he's a sage, don't take it for granted that the meaning of the word given by the Rishi has to be taken into account. So that level of objectivity has been shown as an ideal in Shastras. So that is Lakshana Karana. Lakshana Karana comes from the Lakshya. When you are observing a Lakshya and you are looking at all the common features of your Lakshyas, that is instance cases, when you are doing Lakshana, this example by Bhartrihari is telling you that there is a possibility that you have a respect for the Rishi, and that is why you, while doing Lakshana, you may be biased by your respect for the Rishi, but don't do that. You overcome even that respect while doing Lakshana of the Lakshyas. Okay.
Thank you very
Thank
much,
you.
Acharya. Thank you very much.